The conference hall fell silent the moment Michael's voice cut through the polite conversation like a blade. That's why I don't let my wife handle anything important. She's too stupid for numbers. And every eye turned toward the woman standing behind him. The woman who had spent 23 years building him up while he tore her down. The woman whose hands trembled slightly as she set down her champagne glass, looked him straight in the eye, and said with a calm that sent chills down every spine in the room, "You're right, Michael. I was stupid enough to let you take credit for my accounting degree. Stupid enough to balance your failing business books for free every night for 2 decades. And stupid enough to believe that love meant making myself smaller so you could feel bigger." Michael Harrison had always been the golden boy, the entrepreneur everyone admired, the man with the firm handshake and the winning smile who ran a successful consulting firm in downtown Seattle. But what nobody at that charity gala knew was that behind every financial report, every major client decision, every strategic move that made him look like a genius, there was Caroline, his wife of 23 years, the woman with a master's degree in business analytics from Stanford, who had given up her own career when their daughter Emma was born, who had poured her brilliance into making him shine, while raising their child and maintaining a home that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow within its walls. It started so gradually that Caroline couldn't pinpoint exactly when Michael's occasional dismissiveness had turned into outright contempt, when his jokes at her expense had stopped being playful and started drawing blood, when she had become invisible in her own marriage except when he needed her expertise late at night, sitting at the kitchen table going over his accounts while he slept soundly, trusting her to fix whatever mess he'd made while simultaneously telling their friends she didn't understand business. The charity gala was supposed to be a celebration. Michael's firm had just landed its biggest contract yet, a multi-million-dollar deal with a tech giant, and he was being honored as Businessman of the Year, standing in a glittering ballroom surrounded by Seattle's elite, holding court with investors and competitors alike, with Caroline dutifully by his side in a dress she'd altered herself because Michael had said the budget was tight, even though she'd seen the receipt for his new Rolex. She had been chatting with Margaret Chen, an old colleague from her Stanford days who now ran her own investment firm, catching up on years of lost connection. When Margaret had asked about the brilliant financial analysis in Michael's recent pitch deck, noting that it had her signature style all over it, before Caroline could respond, Michael had swooped in, placed a possessive hand on her shoulder, and launched into his explanation with that charming laugh everyone loved, saying he'd tried to let Caroline help but she'd gotten confused by the complex modeling, that he'd had to redo everything himself, that Margaret shouldn't bore his wife with business talk because numbers make her head hurt. And then came those words that made something inside Caroline finally snap. "That's why I don't let my wife handle anything important. She's too stupid for numbers." The silence that followed was deafening. 100 conversations, dying mid-sentence, glasses frozen halfway to lips, because even in a room full of people who barely knew them, everyone could feel the wrongness of the moment, the casual cruelty of a man who had just humiliated his wife in front of Seattle's most influential citizens. Margaret's face had gone pale, her eyes darting between Michael's oblivious smile and Caroline's carefully neutral expression, and later she would tell people that she'd seen something shift in Caroline's eyes, a light that had been dimmed for years suddenly blazing back to life. Caroline picked up her small clutch purse, removed a folded piece of paper with hands that no longer trembled, and handed it to Margaret with a gentle smile that didn't match the revolution happening in her chest, saying in a voice that carried across the silent ballroom, "You're right, Michael. I was stupid enough to let you take credit for my accounting degree, stupid enough to balance your failing business books for free every night for 2 decades. And stupid enough to believe that love meant making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. But I'm not stupid enough to let it continue." She turned to Margaret, her old friend whose eyes were now wide with shock and growing understanding, and explained with the precision of the analyst she had always been that the paper contained the password to a private cloud folder where Margaret would find the original drafts of every major project Michael had taken credit for in the past decade, each one annotated in Caroline's handwriting, time-stamped, backed up, documented, not because she had ever planned to expose him, but because old habits from her Stanford days died hard and she had always kept meticulous records. The Westbrook merger strategy was mine, Caroline said, her voice steady now, growing stronger with each word. The Jensen portfolio restructuring that saved Michael's firm 3 years ago. That was me working until 4 a.m. for 6 weeks straight, while he told clients he was burning the midnight oil. And the recent tech pitch that won him this award tonight. I wrote that analysis while recovering from pneumonia because Michael said he needed it and I was too stupid to say no. The room had erupted in whispers, phones discreetly emerging from pockets, because everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. The unraveling of a carefully constructed image, the emergence of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for over 2 decades. Michael's face had gone from confusion to anger to something that might have been fear as he grabbed Caroline's arm, not roughly but desperately, hissing at her to stop making a scene, to think about what she was doing to his reputation. And Caroline had looked down at his hand on her arm and then up at his face with an expression of such profound sadness that several people in the crowd would later say it broke their hearts to witness. I have thought about it, Michael, she said quietly, gently removing his hand. I've thought about it every time you introduced me as just a housewife. Every time you rolled your eyes when I spoke at dinner parties. Every time our daughter asked me why Daddy talks to you like you're not very smart. And I've realized that I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at myself for teaching Emma that this is what love looks like. For showing her that a woman's intelligence should be hidden to protect a man's ego. And I can't do it anymore. She turned back to the crowd, to Margaret and the dozens of other successful people watching this domestic drama unfold, and with a grace that came from finally speaking a truth she'd buried for years, she explained that she wasn't trying to destroy Michael, that she still cared about him, despite everything, but that she could no longer be complicit in her own erasure. I'm leaving, Caroline said simply, directing her words to Michael but speaking loudly enough for the room to hear, not with anger or revenge, but because our daughter is 18 now, starting college, learning what to expect from relationships, and I need to show her that intelligence isn't something to hide. That partnership means building each other up, not one person sacrificing everything so the other can shine, and that it's never too late to choose yourself. She handed her wedding ring to a stunned Michael, kissed his cheek with a tenderness that somehow made the moment even more devastating, and walked out of that ballroom with her head high, leaving behind a husband who suddenly looked lost without the woman he'd spent decades diminishing, a crowd of witnesses who would never see either of them the same way again, and a life that had stopped fitting her so long ago, she'd almost forgotten what authentic existence felt like. The days that followed were harder than Caroline had anticipated, not because she regretted her decision, but because untangling 23 years of intertwined life required confronting. Just how much of herself she had surrendered, how many dreams she had deferred, how many times she had bitten her tongue when she should have roared. She moved into a modest apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, took the settlement her lawyer negotiated with, surprising ease. Michael's attorney seemed almost eager to avoid a public divorce trial after. The Gala incident had already started circulating through Seattle's business community and began the disorienting work of rediscovering who Caroline Martinez had been before she became Mrs. Harrison, before she became invisible. Emma, their daughter, had called her crying the night after the gala, not with anger, but with pride and pain intertwined, saying, "Mom, I've been waiting my whole life for you to do that. But I'm so sad it took him hurting you publicly before you felt you could leave." And in that conversation, Mother and daughter had both wept for the years of subtle toxicity Emma had absorbed. The ways she had unconsciously learned to make herself smaller in her own relationships. The cycle they were both now consciously choosing to break. Michael, for his part, fell apart in ways that shocked everyone who knew him. His confident veneer cracked without Caroline's invisible labor holding his world together, revealing a man who had built his entire identity on taking credit for someone else's genius and genuinely couldn't function without her. His business began to struggle within weeks as clients realized the quality of analysis they had come to expect was suddenly absent. His financial projections became sloppy without Caroline's meticulous eye catching his mistakes, and he found himself sitting alone in his big empty house, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had lost and how thoroughly he had taken it for granted. 3 months after the gala, Caroline received an unexpected call from Margaret Chen, who offered her a position as senior analyst at her investment firm, saying the industry had been abuzz about the woman behind Michael Harrison's success and that several firms were hoping to recruit her now that the truth was out. Caroline accepted, not for revenge or validation, but because stepping into that office, introducing herself with her full credentials, having colleagues treat her expertise with respect felt like coming home to herself after decades of exile. She threw herself into work with the passion she had suppressed for years, mentoring younger analysts, particularly women, about maintaining their identity within partnerships, about the difference between supportive sacrifice and and she found that her story resonated far beyond Seattle's business community, sparking conversations about invisible labor, credit theft in marriages, and the countless brilliant women who had made their husbands' careers possible while being dismissed as just wives and mothers. Meanwhile, Michael began the painful journey of genuine self-reflection, prompted initially by Emma's refusal to speak to him unless he got therapy and really examined his treatment of Caroline. And slowly, with professional help, he started to see the patterns he had inherited from his own father, the insecurities he had masked with arrogance, the way he had needed Caroline to be small so he could feel large, because deep down he had never believed he was enough on his own merits. 6 months after Caroline left, he showed up at her apartment not with flowers or grand gestures, but with a letter he had written and rewritten dozens of times. A letter that didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, but simply acknowledged, specifically and painfully, every way he had diminished her, every contribution he had stolen, every cruel word that he now saw for the abuse it had been. "I'm not asking you to come back," Michael said, standing in her doorway looking smaller somehow, humbler, more human than she'd seen him in years. "I'm not even asking you to forgive me, because I'm not sure I deserve that. But I needed you to know that I see it now. I see everything you did, everything you were, everything I was too insecure and selfish to acknowledge. And I'm sorry, Caroline, I'm so deeply sorry for wasting your brilliance, for making you believe you had to hide your light, for teaching our daughter that diminishment was love." Caroline stood there, looking at this man she had spent half her life with, and she felt something unexpected. Not love, not anymore, but a kind of compassionate closure. A recognition that they had both been trapped in toxic patterns, and that while his behavior had been inexcusable, his growth was still worth acknowledging. "Thank you for saying that," she replied gently. "I hope you mean it. I hope you do the work to really change. Not for me, but for yourself, and for Emma, and for whatever relationships you have in the future. Because, Michael, you were capable of better than what you gave us. And it hurt us both that you chose cruelty when you could have chosen partnership. They didn't get back together. Some breakages are too fundamental to repair. Some relationships serve their purpose by ending, but over time, they developed a respectful distance, co-parents to Emma. Two people who had loved each other once and hurt each other deeply and were now learning to exist separately with wisdom earned through pain. Emma, watching both her parents transform in different ways, later told Caroline that the Gala moment had been traumatic, but also liberating. That seeing her mother choose herself had given her permission to do the same in her own life, to pursue her dreams of engineering without downplaying her intelligence to make others comfortable, to expect partnership rather than settling for being someone's supporting character. 2 years after that fateful night, Caroline stood in front of a different conference room, this time as the keynote speaker at a women's leadership summit, telling her story not for sympathy, but as testimony to the countless women who had made themselves smaller, who had hidden their intelligence, who had done invisible labor while their partners collected accolades. And she told them what she wished she'd known decades earlier, that you can love someone deeply and still choose yourself. That leaving toxicity isn't failure but wisdom. That it's never too late to reclaim your voice, your brilliance, your space in the world. I was 46 years old when I finally spoke up, Caroline said to the hundreds of faces watching her. Some nodding with recognition, some crying quietly, all listening with the intensity of people hearing their own hidden stories validated. I was 46 when I stopped being stupid, not stupid in the way my ex-husband meant it, but stupid in the way I had betrayed myself. And if my story teaches you anything, let it be this: your intelligence is not a threat to manage. Your competence is not something to hide, and real love, real partnership, amplifies both people rather than requiring one to dim so the other can shine. The applause that followed was thunderous. But what moved Caroline most was the line of women who waited afterward to thank her, to share their own stories of invisible contributions and reclaimed voices, to tell her that watching her walk out of that gala with her dignity intact had given them courage to make their own hard choices. And she realized that the most valuable thing she could offer wasn't her analytical brilliance, though that mattered, but her testimony that transformation is possible, that you can rebuild yourself after decades of diminishment, that speaking your truth might hurt, but silence hurts more. Michael, who heard about the speech through Emma, sent Caroline a brief text that simply said, "You are always the brilliant one. I'm sorry it took losing you for me to say it out loud. I'm proud of who you've become." And Caroline read it with a soft smile, grateful not for his validation. She didn't need that anymore, but for the confirmation that growth was real, that people could change, that even painful endings could transform everyone involved if they were willing to do the honest work of self-examination. On the evening of that summit, Caroline stood on her apartment balcony watching the sun set over Elliott Bay, thinking about the scared woman who had walked out of that gala 2 years ago, the terrified certainty that she was doing the right thing, even though it meant blowing up her entire life. And she felt a profound gratitude for that moment of courage, for the version of herself who had finally said enough, who had valued her dignity more than false peace, who had chosen the hard path of authenticity over the comfortable prison of pretense. She thought about Emma, thriving at college, unafraid to be brilliant, choosing friends and partners who celebrated rather than diminished her, breaking cycles that had persisted for generations. And Caroline understood that this was the real legacy she was leaving, not business success or public vindication, but a daughter who knew her worth, who had seen her mother model the courage to choose herself, who would never let anyone call her stupid and mean it as anything other than the revelation of their own insecurity. The moral of Caroline's story wasn't about revenge or even justice in the traditional sense, but about the quiet revolution that happens when we stop abandoning ourselves to maintain relationships that require our diminishment, when we recognize that true partnership celebrates both people's gifts rather than demanding one person's eclipse, when we understand that it's never too late to speak up, step out, and reclaim the brilliant, worthy, magnificent person we were before we learn to make ourselves small. Because the most important relationship we'll ever have is the one with ourselves, and betraying that for anyone else's comfort isn't love, it's a slow erasure that no one deserves, no matter how long we've endured it, no matter how much we've invested in the illusion, no matter how scary the truth might be to speak.